Today's daf we're going to be learning is Ketubot, daf ayin bet, a very essential, important daf that if you've never learned before, there's definitely parts in this daf that are very, I would say, famous, known specifically about hair covering and all sorts of other issues between husband and wife. This week's learning, though you might not think hair covering is between husband and wife, maybe we'll have time to talk about that. This week's learning is sponsored by Judy Shapiro for the upcoming autumn yurtzites of her mother, Dina Teichman, and her brother, David Teichman, her father, Albert Teichman, and her mother-in-law, Margaret Shapiro. Today's daf is sponsored anonymously in memory of Elisheva Frist, who tragically died this week at the age of 36. Elisheva, whose kindness touched so many lives, will be missed by her many friends and acquaintances. May her memory be an eternal blessing. Today's daf is sponsored in memory of Major Bar Falach, who was killed this week while protecting our country, Israel. Okay, it's been a week. We're going to get started now at the end of the very last words of Ayin Aleph Amud Bet. Hamadir et ishto. We're in the middle of all these cases where he basically forbids his wife through a vow to do certain things. So one of them was to go to a party, celebratory event, or to a house of mourning. They might be a little surprised by the question, but again, you have to sometimes just put your head a little bit in someone else's head. We understand Beit HaMishteh ikanu el b'faneh. He's basically restricting her. Okay, and this is, by the way, this came up after class the other day, so I should really mention it. Like it's kind of taken as obvious, but maybe sometimes things aren't obvious, which is that these Mishnayot are trying to prevent husbands from basically controlling their wives' lives, right? It's saying this is not something that we think is the way the relationship's supposed to be. It's where we ended yesterday with the Baal and the Ish, and that it's not about a husband using this as an opportunity to control his wife, even though, right, theoretically, he can annul her vows, and he does have certain areas of control, but not to abuse his privileges and use it in ways that are restrictive to the woman. So to not go to a party, that's very restrictive. But lebeit avel, ma'ino el b'fanei yikava, to not allow her to go pay a shiva call. Who likes to go pay shiva calls now? This isn't necessarily true. Obviously, women would want to go pay a shiva call. It's part of their right of freedom as well. That's why the question is a little bit strange. But I think what they're getting at is it's not like it's a fun activity, and what's in her best interest? It's in her self-interest. Self-interest to go to a party is to hang out with her friends. When you go to a Beit Avel, a house of mourning, you don't exactly hang out with your friends. It's not a fun thing to do. So what's the big deal kind of thing if he prevents her from doing it? Or I should say it in different words, what's the harm done to her? Okay, so Tana lemachal himeta ve'en kol b'riat sofda. So they say, according to a Braita, what will happen to you if you don't go to a shiva house? Tomorrow you may die and nobody's going to come to eulogize you. In other words, this is a bit of the answer, right? The question was a little strange. The answer is even more strange, which is it's all about self-interest, right? Go to a shiva house so that people will come to your shiva house. Okay. In the first version, it says no one will come eulogize you. Some people say ein kol b'riat sofna. People won't come to bury you. Okay? In other words, it's very important. You learn something important here. Again, sounds a little weird. You're doing it so that people will do it for you. But, it's not the only reason, obviously, to do it. But they're basically pointing out that there is harm done to her if she won't go. Because if she doesn't go, then people won't come to eulogize her. Tan. Okay, these Breitot, by the way, are not referring to her. These Breitot are referring to in general. Anyone should go do this so that people will come and eulogize you. So they're basically applying it to here and saying, well, what do you see? You see here, if you prevent her from going, nobody's going to come to her shiva house. Tanya haya Rabbi Meir omer, my dachtiv tov lalechet al beit evel milechet al beit mishteh. Okay, Rabbi Meir was known to quote this pasuk, very famous pasuk from Kohelet. Better to go to a house of mourning than to go to a party. Because this is where people will end up ultimately, and the live person should take it to heart. To which they say, "My v'chayitin libo." What does it mean? The person living should take it to heart. Dvarim shel mita, things about death, meaning he should have death or she should have death in her mind. This sefad yisabdune. If you eulogize people, they will eulogize you. Tikval yikbarune. If you bury them, they will bury you. Didal yidlune. different interpretations of what this means. Rashi says it means that if you raise your voice in crying, people will then cry for you. That was the big thing at funerals, the crying. Dilevai yelavune, if you say lilavot tameh, to escort the dead body, then people will escort you. And dita'an yitanune, if you lift it up, right, maybe to lift it, put it in the grave, then people will do that for you. Okay. Therefore, by preventing her from doing this, he's basically preventing her from having a respectable funeral or respectable death. Now again, we get into this idea of a husband using abusing his rights. So he has a right to say to her, I won't let you go to this party or the Shiva house because I don't like the people there. So now that's what the Mishna had said. So first of all, if he claims mishum davar achil, the Mishna wasn't even clear what they meant. We already explained it based on what we're going to see in the Gemara. It's because he doesn't like the people there. That's what we mean davar achil. Amar Rav Ashi lo amaran elad itchazak avalo itchazak lav kol kamine. There's a line drawn here, though. He can't just say, look, I don't really like the crowd. It has to be that these people have been proven to, whether it's engaged in licentious behavior, which is most likely the issue here. Basically, he has to have proof for it, where they're known in a real way. It's not just, I'm a little worried about who might be there. That's not good enough. Okay, so again, it's the line drawn between how much can he do this, right? Where do we put the line? Comes Rav Ashi, and he says, it's not where you might have thought it might be. It can't be just concern, but it has to be a serious concern where he has somewhat of a proof. Again, chazak is not exactly proof, but it's close to a proof. Now we have these last cases of Mishna, which weren't so clear. If he says to her, I'm making a nidda, you must say what you said to me, to someone else, or say what I said to you. So vitema, so what? Let her say it. What's the big deal? Dvarim shel kalon. It's embarrassing things. Some people say what they're talking about is it was things that they whispered to each other while they were having relations, or something very personal, something that was embarrassing to tell to somebody else, right? There's certain things you speak to with your spouse that you're not going to necessarily say in front of other people, whether it's things having to do with while you're engaging in relations, or even other things that are very personal and private that you don't necessarily want other people to know. This is a very strange one. She fills up and dumps in the garbage, right? He makes this nidda. You have to fill up and dump things in the garbage. V'ta'avid. Okay, so right, it's like making her take the garbage out. What's the issue here? What are we talking about? Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel shetimale v'nofetz. This is understood in a totally different context. That after having relations, he makes a vow that after having relations, she needs to empty out her body from the semen so she doesn't get pregnant. Okay, exactly how she does this reminds us of those other sugya we talked about. But basically, in other words, it means if he forces her to use birth control. Okay, you can understand it in a looser manner. That doesn't literally mean he fills her up and then she empties herself out, but more that if he forces her to use birth control, makes her take a vow about it, that could be again a breach of contract. And that is not exactly okay. We're going to I should distinguish between a breach of contract, right? What we basically mean is this is something she can't stay married to him. Right, and he needs to give her divorce, and since it's his fault, she gets the ketuba money, which is going to be in contrast to the next Mishna, which is going to be it's her fault. She loses her ketuba money, and then the next Mishna is going to have where it was even the whole marriage is dissolved because there was a mistake from the beginning. Okay, so there's different stages. Okay, in these cases, the marriage is valid, and that's why you need divorce. But he breaks the contract of the ketuba, and therefore she gets her money back. Or she gets her ketuba money because he broke the contract and therefore has to give it to her. In the next case, she'll break the contract and therefore she'll have to lose her money. B'manita Tana, and a Braita, it explains it different. He makes her fill up 10 jugs of water and dump them in the garbage. And this is a meaningless activity, right? It's like Pitom and Ramses, the Jews had to build in Egypt. They would build and destroy, build and destroy. That's kind of what he's telling her to do. Go fill up the water, which, by the way, wasn't like opening the spout in the sink, filling it up and dumping it, right? It was much more complicated job in those days. We understand if he forces her to use birth control, so that's good reason to get her ketuba back and force him to divorce her. Ela lematnita, or get her ketuba, not back, but get it. Ela lematnita ma'inaf galamina. But according to the Braita, so what? So we ask her to do a ridiculous thing, but ta'avit, so she'll do it. What's the big deal, right? Is that a reason to make her get her ketuba money and make him divorce her? Yes, because he makes her look like an imbecile. I mean, to be doing that, and she goes down, she brings the water up, she dumps. She goes down, she brings the water, she dumps. She looks like an idiot, and that makes her look bad. Anything, and this is going to be an intro almost to the next Mishna, things that make people look bad, and we're going to get to some other cases right now, is also reason for a breach of contract here. Amarav Kahana, Hamadirat Ishto Shalo Tish'al, Shalo Tash'il Nafa Ukvara Rechaim B'Tanur. If he makes her take a vow, he vows that she not borrow or lend all sorts of kitchen utensils, okay, different kinds of sifters, the rechaim, the millstone, the oven. Now, this is something that women apparently did all the time. Nowadays, most of us have the utensils we need in our kitchen. If we don't, okay, we manage without them. Right? We have every gadget there is on the planet. But in those days, first of all, often a lot of their kitchen stuff was in their yard. Their ovens were in their yards, and they would go from house to house, and they would always borrow stuff. There's a lot of sugyas that talk about borrowing. If he makes her vow that, or he takes a vow that she can't use other people's borrow or lend, that puts her in a very bad place in society, okay? Because that's something that everybody does. Right. We all know that there's a person who won't ever lend out her stuff. You know, everyone looks at her differently. Why, we're all one way and you're different from us. That makes people stand out, especially if you're not doing something that's, it's interesting because it's not just to lend out. You might get upset. Why won't you lend out your stuff? But even that she won't borrow is a breaking of what goes on in their society. That's just so common that we all go to each other's houses. I need some eggs. I need some this, right? We do that all the time. So it basically is, right, these are all, I see you're all writing in the chat, right, these are forms of abuse, right, for not allowing her to, it's almost disconnecting her from society, from the chevra. So if he does those things, because he causes her to have a bad name among her neighbors. Tanya Namihachi, there's also a Braita to support what Rav Kahana said, which the beginning of it's going to be word for word what he said, and then I'll have another case. That's exactly word for word what we just said, so I'm not going to translate. Here comes the second part of the Braita. And here's our intro to the next section, which is v'chein he, and the reverse. If she takes a neder, shenadra, and this is very interesting. She takes a neder, shelo tish'al, lo tash'il, nafa ukvra rechaim b'tanor, and they add, so she takes a neder that she herself won't borrow, won't lend. She won't embroider nice clothes for the children, for his children. It's not because the kids will walk around without clothes or something like that. It's that the neighbors will talk about this woman. Now, here's the interesting part. When they talk about her negatively, that affects him, right? We all know when you have someone you're with, significant other, you're basically, you each, what one does, it reflects on the other, right? Whether you right, not even only if you're married, if you're engaged, if you have a girlfriend or a boyfriend, or right, all those situations, one reflects on the other. Sometimes becomes a difficulty in a relationship because one is not happy with things the other one is doing. And because of that, if she ends up with a bad name among her neighbors, that's grounds for him to divorce her and not give her ketuba money, because she's broken their contract. Okay, now, that is our intro to the next Mishna, because this was all things he can't do. Now we're going to switch to, okay, if you're talking about the abusive husband, now we have the wife who can do all sorts of things that, again, either reflect poorly on the husband or affect him, besides just reflect poorly in terms of his place in society, but might actually affect him very negatively in a halachic way, which we're going to get to right now. These women can be divorced without having to give them their ketuba money. Dat Moshe. These are the two main categories. If she doesn't keep Dat Moshe and Dat Yehudit. Okay, what is Dat Moshe? What is Dat Yehudit? The Mishna is going to explain. Dat Moshe. Ma'achilato she'eno musal. She feeds him food that she hasn't taken truma to masrot, the tithes from. Now, this is forbidden by Torah law to eat food without tithing the produce. And she's the one in the kitchen. He has no idea. This is going to be the idea behind the first four things, which are all Dat Moshe. They're all Torah law, and they're things that she is in charge of. And she could basically dupe him into thinking that she's done these things and affect him. He's going to break the law right now. He's going to break halacha because he's going to eat food that wasn't tithed, and he doesn't even know. The Gemara is going to ask, well, if he doesn't know, then how is he divorcing her without a ketuba? We'll get to that. Okay, so the next one is Mishamash nidda. She claims she's not in nidda, and she happens to be in nidda, and she sleeps with him and has relations with him, and that basically makes him, right, that's very serious. That's current if you sleep with your wife when she's in nidda. And she didn't tell him, right? She manages that part of the relationship. She knows when she's in nidda. He has no idea. Velo kotzala challa. She doesn't take, this is more, you wonder why this didn't come earlier. This is like the maser. She doesn't take out the challa, right? The hafrashat challa. And noderet ve'ena mekayemet. She takes a vow and she doesn't keep to her vow. It's also something only she knows. How would he know? She took a vow, right? It's something I could say between myself. I don't need witnesses. I don't need him to be around. I could say something and he'll never know. And then I don't keep my vow. You'll ask, well, how does that affect him? The Gemara will explain, right? Because all the others clearly affect him. He ends up doing something that's wrong by Torah law. In this case, he doesn't do anything wrong, but we'll see how it affects him as well. That's the first category. Ezo Dat Yehudit. What is Dat Yehudit? Yotza v'rosh ha'parua. She goes out, presumably she goes out into the shuk, to the marketplace, with her hair uncovered. Tova b'shuk. She does the spinning of the thread in the shuk. Okay, we don't yet know what's so bad about that. Okay, even rosh ha'parua, we're going to have to see what's wrong with this. What's the issue? Anyway, we'll get back to that when we see it in the Gemara. Midaberet im kol adam. She speaks with every man she meets. Abba Shaul Omer, he adds, Afa mekalelet yodav b'fanav, one who curses his parents in front of him. She curses out her in-laws in front of her husband. And Rabbi Tarfon adds, Omer, Afa kolanit, also a woman who screams a lot. Ezoi kolanit, what does this mean? She's speaking in her house and her neighbors hear her voice. Okay, right? I happened to lived once next to a very noisy neighbor. You heard her screaming all the time, right? You can see, right? It creates, again, we're going to have to see in the Gemara how the Gemara understands all these cases. Right now, it just sounds like she screams a lot, right? It's kind of like airing out your dirty laundry because, you hear all the things she's upset about her kids about or upset about her husband about. Okay, so these are all things, and these are in a totally different category than the first. They all seem to be, by the way, in the Tosefta, whenever I teach about Kisei Rosh, I like to always bring that in the list of going out with her hair uncovered, it also mentions going out with clothes that are torn, right? Where, the question is going out with her hair uncovered, is she breaking laws of tzniut? Is the issue here tzniut, that it's not modest? And if your wife goes out not modestly, that reflects on you as their husband. Or is it that it's not respectable? Like in their society, people walked around wearing hats, or hair coverings. And if you didn't walk out wearing a hair covering, it was like walking around with torn clothing. And is it a matter of a respect issue? And that, we know in some societies, everybody wears a hat or everybody wears so there's a question about what and to remember here, the context here is not covering your hair in terms of tzniut. Maybe it's from a tzniut perspective. Maybe it's not. But the issue here is not what's forbidden for a woman to do. It's what is a breach of contract between her and her husband, right? That if she does this, it reflects poorly on the husband. And then the question is why? Is it because she's walking around not sanua fashion, not modest? Or is it because that's the way married women walked around? And if she doesn't do that, it's like she's walking around with torn clothing. So it's a good question, exactly. Not to mention nowadays people walk around with torn clothing, right? As a fashion thing. Anyway, it's a big question. It's very unclear in this Mishna, which leads to all sorts of different opinions about hair covering in general. Okay, coming now to the Gemara. What's the case? If he knows, so he won't eat it. Okay, or theoretically, he could actually be mafresh. He could just take his own trumot masrot from it. It's not like it's not something he can do. Idilo yada, if he didn't know, well, minayada. And the assumption here is he wants to divorce her without giving her ketuba money. He must have figured it out somehow. So it doesn't make any sense. It's a case where she told him, a Kohen came yesterday and he took out the Trumon Masra from the pile, so now it's all fine and you can eat it. And then when he met the Kohen, he said, "Oh, how was the food that you got from me?" And the Kohen says, "I don't know what you're talking about. I never got any food from you." And then he realizes his wife was lying. Okay, we're going to see similar things with the next scenarios. What's the case where he slept with her when she was in nidda and didn't know and then somehow found out? So again, if he knew she was in nidda, nifrosh, so shouldn't sleep with her. If he didn't know, he's allowed to rely on her, meaning she is trustworthy when it comes to laws of nidda. If she says, "I'm not in nidda," then he doesn't do anything wrong by sleeping with her. You can trust her. How do we know this? It's a very interesting law. Normally for halachot, you need some sort of, if you want to eat in someone's house, so you need them to tell you that they eat kosher, right? Because you need eid echad, basically. One witness is believed in these kind of cases, but basically, you do check in some way, or you need, the truth is maybe that's not a good example. Maybe that's actually pretty similar to this. Anyway, in other scenarios, you might need some sort of proof. In this case, her word is enough, okay? How do you know she counts for herself? By the way, here I think they're making a distinction, because if you sleep with your wife when she's in nidda, it's kared. It's much more serious than, let's say, not eating kosher. So maybe there would be a higher standard of, you need some sort of testimony or something that someone where she would tell you, "I'm not in nidda," like people who saw her go to the mikveh or something. So here she counts for herself. The whole thing she manages on her own. You don't need any sort of outside intervention. It says, and she counts for herself 7 days. This is in the Zava, but they learn out Zava to nidda. That means she counts for herself. So what's the case? So how could it be? The first answer is very similar to the previous. She says, "Listen, I had some sort of question about whether I was in nidda or not. I went to this chacham. He told me it's not a problem. And then it turns out he talks to the chacham, and the chacham doesn't know what she's talking about, never spoke to her. Turns out she lied to him, which means she must have been in nidda and lied." And second option is to say, again, you're going to learn more about their society and their relationships with their neighbors. Everyone kind of knew when the other one was that time of the month. And there, it's probably because and this goes back to yesterday, the begadim tzivoniyim, though I forgot to mention on the whole thing of the jewelry and the adornment. Shuli Mishkan has an article about it in Flashback this week. So if you haven't, you can print it out for Shabbat and read it. In any case, the idea here, the begadim tzivoniyim, I mentioned yesterday that women will wear different clothes when they were in nidda and different clothes when they weren't. And that's because they were always dealing with tumah and tara. Everybody needed to know who was tameh and who wasn't. So her neighbors, right, could be the husband wasn't paying attention to what clothes she was wearing, or maybe he wasn't around during the day and only saw her in her night garments. And during the day, she walked around in certain clothing. The neighbors knew she was in nidda. Now, once the neighbors assume she's in nidda, because for whatever reason, if it's her clothes or for some other reason, that actually, again, chazaka, that means she's in nidda, basically. So if she was huchzaka b'shchenotea, there's a halacha that ba'ala lo ke'ala mishum nidda. If he were to sleep with her, if the neighbors knew she was in nidda and then he slept with her, even though the woman claims I wasn't in nidda, this is a different halacha. He will get lashes for having slept with her if he was warned before. He would have to be warned, but if he was warned before that your wife's in nidda and she maybe claims she isn't or something, or she doesn't say anything, that's enough grounds for malkot. In other words, just the neighbors knowing. So that shows the neighbors knowing counts for something. So that would be also grounds for divorce. If she claims she wasn't in nidda and the neighbors say, of course she was in nidda. Again, how we would get into a conversation about this is a really good question. That he's ended up talking to the neighbors about the menstrual cycle of his wife seems a little bit strange. But if that were to happen, then that would be grounds for divorce and she would lose her ketuba money. Okay, even though, again, what's interesting about it, there's no real proof. Okay, the issue is here that that they just said she was in nidda and that's enough. V'lo kotzala challa hechidami. Again, the same question. She didn't take challa, idi yada nifrosh. If he knew, he wouldn't eat it. Idi lo yada minayada. And if he didn't know, then where did he find out? So, the knitter, I had a knitter, a professional knitter was in my house. It would be nice to have that every Shabbos. But a knitter was in my house and he fixed my bread, meaning he took the challa out. And again, Azal Shaila, he asked the guy, and it turns out, Ishtakach Shikra, it was a lie. Now we have to deal with what's so bad about this. Why does it affect him? In other words, maybe it's bad, but it's her bad, not his bad. Okay, another one of these statements, the rabbi said, why the children die. Again, this is a way they struggled with children dying. How could that possibly be? What did they do wrong? Well, if the parents take vows and don't keep them, their children die. Causes the death of their children. Again, this isn't always meant to be tit for tat, but they do say this, which then means that for him, right, whether this is actually true or not, but he has this feeling, if my wife is going to do this, it might affect our children, and I don't want to be married to a woman who, is going to cause possibly the death of her children. Where do we get this? Okay, this is a pasuk from from Kohelet. I was just double checking. There's a bunch from Kohelet today. Don't let your mouth cause your body to sin. What would that be? By vowing and not keeping to it. And then it says at the end of that pasuk, what will happen? God will smite the works of your hands. Maaseh yadecha. So, what is your handiwork? Banav u'benotav, your children. So in other words, if you do that, then God will smite you. Okay, Rav Nachman Amar Mehacha. Rav Nachman brings a different pasuk. This pasuk is from Yirmiyahu. Lashav hiketi et benechem. Lashav, I smote your children for lashav, for no good reason. Okay, what does it mean for no good reason? It doesn't mean for no good reason. It means al iskeshav, because they were involved with things that were meaningless, meaning they made vows that they didn't keep. Tanya, haya. Okay, now we're going to have a machloket in two of the cases that we saw about should a husband try to rectify, this is a very interesting machloket, should he try to rectify the situation, or should he divorce her and not even try to rectify the situation? So Tanya, if you know your wife takes vows and doesn't keep them, so you should go and make her make a new vow. To which the Gemara says, Yidirena, that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Make her take more vows? They say, okay, no. How do you fix her? What it means to say is like this. Oh, sorry. Yidirena, but how's that going to fix the situation? That's just going to make it worse. She'll take more vows. What it meant is, Ela Yachzor, and this is very strange, V'yaknitena, get her very angry about something. Kadesha tidor b'fanav v'yaferla. Now remember, the husband can annul her vows. Now, what happened in this case, the regular cases, where she's a nadranit, she makes nidda, he obviously never hears her make the nidda. If he had heard her, he would have stopped them. So this woman constantly makes nidders. You want her to make them in front of you so you can hear about them and annul them. So get her angry so that instead of making her nidder in her room, she'll make it in front of you in a moment of anger, and then you'll be able to annul them. Now, of course, it doesn't preclude her from making other ones. So it doesn't exactly really resolve the situation. But anyway, the rabbis say, which is basically addressing my issue just in a bit of a different way. You shouldn't live with a snake in close quarters. Okay, you wouldn't want to live with a snake in a glove, right? You'd be attacked by the snake. Why would you live with a woman who, yes, you might get her to make a nidda in front of you, but she might make lots of others in other places, and that will end up causing the death of your children. So definitely, it's not worth the risk, so you should divorce her. Tanya, Haya Rabbi Yehuda Omer. If you know she doesn't take the challa, okay, so fix it. Take the challa on your own. If you live with a wife and this is what she does, so just fix it yourself. What's the big deal? And then you can stay married. Right? You wouldn't live with a snake. In other words, right? It's a very nice idea, but she's the one in the kitchen. You're the one who's eating the food. You might forget one day, then you'll end up eating stuff that's forbidden by Torah law. Dangerous. If you say it on the neder, all the more so, you should say, if you say it on the bread case, that your Rabbi Yehuda, who said you can rectify the situation, all the more so you'll say it in the neder case. But if you say it in the neder case, it's much more dangerous to maybe eat the challa, even though the other one has to do with your sons dying or your children dying, but it's that's not such a direct connection. Whereas here, there's a direct connection. If you forget, you're going to eat food that wasn't fixed properly. And therefore, Rabbi Meir, who said it by the neder, wouldn't necessarily offer the same advice as Rabbi Yehuda offered in the case of the challa. Dat Yehudit. Now we get to the interesting kisay rosh sugya about covering your hair. This is the main sugya about hair covering. And the other sugya is in bracha, where it talks about se'ar b'isha erva, that it's erva. Okay, there it mentions the word erva in the context of hair. Here, it doesn't mention erva at all. Could be that that's the basis, as I said, could be not. To which, so now it's in the category, we finished with the deoraita laws, that these have to do with Torah law, and these all have to do Dat Yehudit with rabbinic laws. Rosha parua deoraiti, but what are you talking about? The responsibility for a woman to cover her hair appears in the Torah. Where does it appear in the Torah? You might say, I don't know, a pasuk that says a woman should cover her hair. So, dichtiv, and this is an interesting kind of proof. In fact, I've seen people write that it's possible this isn't deoraita law. It's a custom that was prevalent in deoraita times, which gives it some sort of status of deoraita, but it's not necessarily that it's deoraita law, although the simple reading of the Gemara seems to say it is a Torah law. Okay, that theory I saw proven from other places where it talks about deoraita, and it's really talking about a custom of the Torah. One of them, by the way, is ketuba, where also it's machloket, is it Torah or rabbinic law? And again, maybe it's shown from the Torah there was a custom at the time, kimor habatulo, that there was this kind of thing, but not necessarily that you have to do it by Torah law. So where did they learn it from? Uparat rosh haisha, in the sota ceremony, they uncover her hair. From there you learn, right, that they were trying to disgrace her, which teaches you, V'tana de Rabbi Yishmael, they learn from here, Azhara leBnot Yisrael shelo yitzu b'parua rosh. This is a warning to Jewish women, there were Jewish girls, that they shouldn't go out with parua rosh. By the way, there are those who say that even non-married women need to cover their hair. It even appears in the Shulchan Aruch in laws of tzniut that even unmarried women need to cover their hair, which obviously changed over time, as many unmarried women, most unmarried women, do not cover their hair anymore. So anyway, that's where they get it from. To which the Gemara says, okay, so what's this Dat Yehudit then, if covering your hair is by Torah law? To which the Gemara says, turning out on the bed, deoraita kalta shapir dami. It's a matter of how much you're covering. According to Torah law, putting a basket on your head, these are the baskets, according to Rashi, anyway, the Rambam has a different interpretation. Going with Rashi, I could talk on for an hour at least about these topics, maybe even 2 or 3, but we're going to keep it short here. The basket on your head that the women would wear, you know, you always see women in the shuk, like these pictures from then of women putting these baskets on their head, which clearly doesn't cover a lot of her hair. So according to Torah law, you just need some sort of covering, which again raises the question, if her hair is erva, how could that resolve the issue, right? So it's confusing. Right? This is why there's a lot of confusion about hair covering and a lot of different opinions, because these sources are not clear cut what exactly the issue is here. Dat Yehudit afilu kalta nami asul. But according to Dat Yehudit, even a kalta is not enough. So in other words, if you go out to the shuk with just a kalta, you've kept the Torah law, but you haven't kept the rabbinic law, and on those grounds, the husband can divorce her. Amar Rabbi Asi, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Here's a big line that's going to be very unclear to the Gemara, and even when the Gemara answers, or based on part of the Gemara's question, there's 2 different interpretations which affect women covering their hair in more private quarters. Okay, we're going to talk about the difference between locations and different. We're going to have the shuk, we're going to have a mavoi, a chatzer. They don't even talk about the house. Okay, and this is why also there's different opinions. You have to cover your hair in your house or not. So let's just define what these spaces are in the times of the Gemara. There was a house, that's where you lived. You had a courtyard. Your courtyard was usually shared with a few other houses. Then a few courtyards would share a mavoi, which was an alley. And this we remember from Eruvin, those who learned Eruvin. And then the mavoi would lead to the public domain. Okay, and that's the shuk. The shuk is Rishuda Rabbi. So now Rabbi Asi says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Amar Rabbi Asi, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, kalta ein ba mishum parua rosh. Wearing a kalta is not a problem. You're not considered that you went out with your hair uncovered if you wear a kalta. So now we just said you are by Dat Yehudit if you go to the shuk. So Habi ba Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Zera said, I don't understand the statement that he made. Ilema b'shuk Dat Yehuditi. That we just learned is Dat Yehudit if you go out into the shuk. Ve'ela b'chatzer, if you want to say, now again, kalta ema mishum parua means 2 things. It means it's not a problem if you walk out with a kalta. It also means if you wear a kalta, right? It also sounds like, but you do need to wear a kalta, okay? So comes this line, I'm reading it the way Tosfot reads it, which I think is the simple pshat reading. If you say in the courtyard, which again is a space where there's a few other houses, so there's other men obviously there. If you go out into the courtyard and he's saying you need a kalta, you're not going to keep anybody married to their husbands. All the husbands are going to divorce their wives because no women go out to the chutzner with a kalta on. Okay, which seems to show that if you're in a courtyard with a space with just a small amount of men, and it's your home turf where everybody knows, and it's part of, right, people say maybe it's a sign you're married or something, right? So everybody knows you're married there, then nobody even wears a kalta there. The Bach and others don't understand it this way, and they say, obviously you wear a kalta in the chutzner. Nobody thinks you don't wear a kalta in the chutzner. What the question here is, it's so obvious he wouldn't need to tell us, okay? Everybody knows that you don't need a kalta, that you don't need more than a kalta. And therefore, you wouldn't even need to tell us this because it's so obvious. And then it becomes, according to that, the halacha is that you have to cover your hair in the chutzner, but only with a kalta, not with a whole covering. Okay? So that's, and then no one even talks about the house. What the house would be a whole separate question. Like the only other source about the house is about Yalta, who, Kimchi, who the walls of her house never saw her hair uncovered. That's some other source, but that's, something else. And she, was seen as someone unique, not that everybody did this. Anyway, a lot of questions here. Like I said, not enough time to delve into all of them, but raising the basic issues. So we're left with this question. What was Rabbi Yochanan talking about in this statement of his? To which Amar Abai v'Item Rav Kahana mechatzer lechatzer v'derech mavoi. What he meant is going from courtyard to courtyard. So again, courtyard, you either don't need anything or a kalta for sure is enough. His chiddush was even between chatzerot, going through the alley from one chatzer to another, even there kalta is enough. And then the shuk, you would need more than a kalta. Tova b'shuk. Okay, then there's also Yerushalmi, which talks about sometimes a mavoi is like a chatzer and sometimes a chatzer is like a mavoi. It depends how many people are there. That's another factor that comes into consideration. Okay, tova b'shuk. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel, what's wrong with spinning your thread in the shuk? That doesn't sound too bad. Remember the story with Chuma, the wife of Abai, and she picked up her arms and everybody saw her arms exposed. So, right, not everybody was Rava, and it caused this whole thing between Rava's wife and Abai's widow. Anyway, also here, if you do this in the shuk, you're going to lift up your arms and people will see your arms. Rav Chistam Ravimi B'Tova, and obviously it's unclear, and this is why there's all different opinions about how much of your arms you need to cover, what part of your arms are we discussing, all that. Rav Chistam Ravimi B'Tova Vrad Keneged Paneh. This has all different interpretations. Is she's spinning the threads and she kind of drops them down Paneh Shalmata near her private parts, and then she does this red thread. People notice it, people look, and then they look under her skirt. Or some people say, no, maybe she holds this red thread in front of her face. It attracts attention to her. Some people say it's varied. It's with a flower. Anyway, she attracts attention to her face. Have people look at her. There it seems to be a sanua. It's niut issue. It's not just talking. It's, she's getting involved with all sorts of people. I was walking behind Rav Ukva. It was a woman. So this Arabian woman who was sitting. She took her pelach and she threw it on the floor, and she had this, again, whatever this tova vrad kenega panah means. She was, let me get the translation right. Right, she was, one second, make sure I'm translating the story exactly right. She was, that's what it was. She was casting her spindle, and then she spun this thread opposite her face. Then, she saw us. Then she threw it down. That's why I got confused with the shadia in the beginning. Shadia in the beginning was casting. This time she threw it down. Amra li ulam havli pelech. She said, young lad, please pick up my pelech. Amar, my spindle. Amar ba Rav Ukva Miltam. Rav Ukva said, This is our Mishna, right? It's like the halachic man. You see the sun setting, you think of about davening, right? So here, think of Benash Mashot. Anyway, says, this is our Mishna. My Amarba. What part of our Mishna? Ravina Amar Tova B'Shuk Amarba. This is Tova B'Shuk. Rabbanan Amre Medaberatim Kol Adam Amarba. This is speaking with every man. That she was flirting with him. She was obviously starting up with him. Abishaul Omer, Afa Mekalelet Yoldav B'Fanav. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, B'Mekalelet Yolidav B'Fnei Molidav. He adds not only cursing the father-in-law in front of her husband, but even in front of his children. Okay, if you curse the grandfather in front of the grandchildren, v'simanech. How do you remember this? Ephraim u'Menashe Reuven u'Shimon Yuli. Right, the grandchildren are like the sons. Amarabba de Amrele, for example, he says. Okay, don't try this at home. Nechle Arya l'Saba ba'apei b'rei. She says, go have a lion eat my father-in-law, and she says it in front of the children. Right, that's also, and it creates very bad tension in the marriage. Rabbi Tarfon Omer Afa Kolanit. By the way, this is addressing that sometimes, right, tension in marriage is caused by bad relations with the parents of one of the spouses. Rabbi Tarfon Omer Afa Kolanit, my Kolanit, Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, ben Mashmat Kola Liskei Tashmish. Okay, she talks about issues of, right, things that happen in the bedroom. Right, so it could be that she's basically being very loud in the house about, arguing with her husband about whether they're having relations, not having relations, and publicizing that to the neighbors. Or she's very loud about it. Now here, what they mean by very loud, which we're going to see in a minute, is it's painful for her and she screams very loudly about it. And then it should be part of the moons in the next minute, right? There's a Mishna all about you can divorce a woman, we're going to get to that in a minute, if she has some sort of blemish. So, okay, there's certain types of blemishes, but this should be in the list of the blemishes, not this. So, they said this must not be the issue. Okay, and this isn't what the Mishna is talking about, and they basically reject it. New Mishna. Now we're going to have two cases, and within two cases, two options within the cases. He betroths a woman upon condition that she doesn't have vows. He doesn't want a wife that's got vows on her, kind of baggage on her. And it turns out she had. So the kiddushin was conditioned upon something. And a mekudeshin. That's a mekachto. This doesn't really have to do with our case. In fact, the Gemara is going to, with our topics here, this is a real kiddushin issue. And in fact, this Mishna appears exactly in kiddushin. The Gemara is going to ask, why does it appear here and why does it appear in kiddushin? So basically, you betroth a woman upon condition and the condition is not met. It's a mekachtaut. You're not even married. Knasas stam, if he marries her without any stipulation. Now notice there's a difference between betrothal in the first case, and this is marrying her. And we're going to see in the Gemara tomorrow's daf, maybe these are connected and that this is building off the second case, but the simple reading seems to be a second case. He marries her without any condition. And it turns out, she had a lot of vows on her. That is grounds for divorce. I want to distinguish these two cases. One is the marriage was never a good marriage to begin with. The second is not as bad, but it could be grounds for divorce, and she loses her ketuba because this is something negative about her that he didn't know that maybe she should have told him in the beginning. Again, same thing. He marries her upon condition that she doesn't have any blemishes. And it turns out she had, and she didn't tell him. And in Mekudesha, the condition wasn't filled, so they're not married. But if it was stam, and then it turns out, and he didn't say anything about the moon, it turned out she had these blemishes. He can divorce her without having to give her the ketuba money. But just like Rav Ashi gave that limitation last time on, it's not just he doesn't want her to go because maybe there's some bad people there. It has to be, also the mumim. It's not just any mum, like, oh, you have a mole somewhere. But kol mumim poslim b'kohanim, poslim b'nashim. The mumim that we're going to allow him to divorce a wife for are the same blemishes that relate to a kohen who can't do the work in the temple. Those blemishes which are listed in Masechet Bechorot. We have many years to get there. Tzrat Hashem, we will get there. Okay, next. The Gemara starts asking, Kiddushin, the exact same Mishna appears. Why would we have the same Mishna twice? To which they say, very obviously, Ketubot itzri chale tana Kiddushin, not to Ketubot. Our topic here was the ketuba case. We wanted to know the tithe shalom ketuba, but to get there, we had to proceed it with the kiddushin case. The case we're foiling these two cases to show, in this case, the kiddushin is invalid. But in this case, it is valid, and it's just that you can divorce her without giving her the ketuba. So our main topic is ketuba, but we had to bring the kiddushin because of that. And obviously in kiddushin, it's the reverse. Hatam, their kiddushin, it's challa, and tana ketubot, atu kiddushin. Okay, their kiddushin was the main topic, and they just foiled it by bringing the ketuba issue. Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Shimon ben Yehotzedek. Be'elu nidarim amru. What nidarim are we talking about here? Not just any vow. It has to be a vow of significance. Shelo tochal basar, shelo tishtei yain, shelo titkashe b'gadim tzivoniyim. This is exactly what we talked about yesterday. These are what we call, according to Rabbi Yossi, inoi nefesh. If it's something that's really serious, like I'm not going to eat meat, I'm not going to eat wine, that's already some grounds for divorce. Ta'anginami hachi, also Braita that says this, be'elu nidarim amru. Right, to support what Rabbi Yochanan said. To which we have a question now. Which one are we referring to? The case where he could say it's a mekach ta'ut, because he gave this condition, no nidarim, and it turns out she had nidarim. But he only really meant these kind of nidarim, right? Ilema aresha doesn't make sense that it's on that case, because if he specifically said on the condition that you don't have nidarim, it sounds like any kind of neder would have been a problem. So it must be ela seifa, must be on the second part, which he didn't specify anything, and then it turned out she had these nidarim, then it's grounds for divorce without giving her the ketuba. Rabbi Ashi disagrees, and with that we'll finish for today. La'olam aresha, even if in the case of the first case where he said, on condition you don't have nidarim, it's only midi de kape ba'inashe avakpeda kpeda, midi de lo kape ba'inashe lo avakpeda kpeda. When he said that you don't have vows, he didn't mean any vow. He meant a serious vow that people don't want their wives to have. And that would be only these vows. So then even the kiddushin that was done by accident, right? The mistaken kiddushin would only be mistaken kiddushin if it had one of these, if it was one of these very serious vows and not a minor vow. Okay, so that's a debate in these last two opinions here. What would be the case in that kind of situation? With that, we'll finish for today. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom and continuing on this sugya in tomorrow's stuff.